BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia. BlackBoxNid88 on Instagram for the bonus podcast. And welcome to BBOR, the home of true crime talk radio and your premier destination for unsolved mysteries, criminal psychology, and exploring the dark side of cyberspace. My name is Ned DeHaan, and I am your host, as well as the creator of AstroPsych 400 here on YouTube, and regular contributor to the Zodiac Killer channel. And a great way to support these shows is just by listening to some more content. But you can also go over to Amazon.com and have a look at the book Killer on a White Horse, written by me, Ned DeHaan. It is a novel, murder mystery, inspired by the Zodiac Manson connection, but it is indeed fictional. However, who doesn't love a good mystery? And there is always the TeeSpring page. Feel free to check out some of the merchandise. And remember, being weird is not a crime. Let the show begin.
Okay, hello everybody. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? Now, just a couple of quick announcements and reminders before we truly begin. The first is that every Monday on Black Box Online Radio, I do a segment about the Zodiac Killer, where I have been discussing the case for some years now, and in the coming weeks and months, I'm going to be launching a new series that is going to be focused more on debating the different aspects of the case. And it's going to be done as a discussion series where people aren't simply going to be trying to win a debate, but rather trying to discuss the facts of the case with some guests, and there are going to be panelists on the program. And there are some possible titles for the show that I've polled you guys for: the Zodiac Killer Challenge, the Zodiac Killer Factor Fiction Forum, and that should be launched in October of this year. So if you're curious about the Zodiac Killer mystery, I invite you to visit Zodiac Monday here on Black Box Online Radio. And as always, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. In addition to that, there's also a set of links in the description box, and one of them is for BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNet88, and that website allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Now, if you heard last week's Jack the Ripper report, you'll remember that I was talking about the Jack the Ripper suspect Carl Feigenbaum and a possible connection to a different set of homicides that took place in a different part of the world. You see, Jack the Ripper was a serial killer who operated in 1888 in England, but much like the Zodiac Killer, there's an enormous web of true crime stories that have been connected to the Ripper. And one of them is the story of the Managua Ripper. Yes, Jack the Ripper in England, and the Managua Ripper in Nicaragua. And I knew that I had to do a follow-up on this particular story. And there's actually an article that has been written by Richard Jones over at JackTheRipperTour.com. And I have to give a big shout out to Richard Jones. I have to give a lot of credit to Richard Jones, not only for the information that he has shared online, but also I think he's an excellent broadcaster. And some people always say, like, who would you want to narrate an audio book that was written about you or written about your life, your autobiography? And I would be like, yeah, Richard Jones, actually. I mean, he's very good at that. And also, he does the interviews for the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel, and he's fair and honest, and he's not trying to demolish anyone's point of view, but rather just simply trying to discuss what other Ripperologists have to say. And I do a lot of that here on Black Box Online Radio, so I appreciate that perspective. But the story of the Managua Ripper begins with this article: 6 women murdered and mutilated, by Richard Jones. Following the murder of Mary Kelly, which took place in Miller's Court off of Dorset Street on November 9th of 1888, Jack the Ripper's murders seem to have come to an end for the next few months. The newspapers were speculating about what might have become of the murderer. Numerous theories were circulating in the pages of the popular newspapers as reporters tried to explain that which we're still trying to explain to today. What had happened to the Whitechapel murderer? Why did the crimes end so abruptly? But in 1889, news broke that similar murders had been carried out in Central America, and the press began speculating that there might have been a resurgence of the Ripper in Central America. The New York Sun published the following special dispatch from Managua, Nicaragua, which is dated on January 24th. Either Jack the Ripper of Whitechapel has immigrated from the scene of his ghastly murders, or he has found an imitator in part of Central America. The people have been greatly aroused by 6 of the atrocious and ghastly murders that have been committed within the city limits. The murderer, or murderers plural, have vanished as quickly as Jack the Ripper did, and no traces have been left for identification. All of the victims were women of the same character of those who met their fates at the hands of the London murderer. Like those women of Whitechapel, they were women who had sunk to the lowest degradations of their calling, and they have been found murdered just as mysteriously, and the murderers are pointing to almost identical methods. 2 were found butchered out of all recognition. Even their faces were most horribly slashed, and in the cases of all the others, their persons were frightfully disfigured. There is no doubt that the sharp instrument, violently but dexterously used, was the weapon that was sent to the poor creatures of the world. There was no apparent motive. Like Jack the Ripper's victims, they have been found in places that were out of the way. 3 of them were in suburbs out of the town, and the others were in dark alleys and corners. 2 of the victims were found with gaudy jewelry, and from this it is urged that the mysterious murderer has not committed the crimes for robbery. In the cases of the other 4, a few coins were found on their persons, representing no doubt that the prospective consideration for the murderer or murderers was to commit the crimes in the name of killing. They were identical to the Whitechapel horrors. All of the victims were in the last stages of shabbiness, besottedness. In fact, in almost every detail, the crimes and characteristics were identical to the Whitechapel crimes. All the murders occurred in less than 10 days, and the perpetrator has not been apprehended. And one more time, that was the story of the Managua Ripper, meaning that in 1889 there was a series of homicides that took place in Nicaragua that were very similar to Jack the Ripper's crimes. And I think that this just goes to show us that these types of activities happen very frequently, and by activities I mean serial killers, because we have to remember that even back in 1884 and 1885, we have the Midnight Assassin, who is another serial killer who's operating in not Nicaragua, but in the United States of America, and it's also connected to the Jack the Ripper story. To get to the heart of the issue, the Midnight Assassin is someone whom some people believe to be Jack the Ripper, and they believe that it was the suspect James Maybrick, that he was the Midnight Assassin in 1884 and 1885, and then he moved back to England, actually, and became Jack the Ripper. And with the Managua Ripper, there are 2 Jack the Ripper suspects that get accused of this crime. One of them is Carl Feigenbaum, a sailor, and the other is Francis Tumblety, who was, by his own Wikipedia page's admission, a quack doctor, someone who was roaming around the world, and also he was just a very, very large personality and character, but he gets accused of being Jack the Ripper, as well as numerous other crimes, perhaps even being the Managua Ripper. And I just think that it goes to show that these types of stories are not isolated incidents. There are just so many that we are learning about, and they're coming out into the news. And I'm going to be very blunt with you guys. I had never heard of the Managua Ripper until I started looking into the Jack the Ripper story. And I think that there are a lot of serial killer stories that just haven't made it to light. Now, did Jack the Ripper move to Nicaragua? It depends on what type of theory that you have about the Jack the Ripper case, because there are numerous theories out there. Number 1, there is the idea that there was a single perpetrator, a single killer, who committed a set of homicides between August 31st and November 9th of 1888. And some people think that one man was responsible for those homicides, and for some reason he just stopped. And then there are these letters that were mailed in during the homicides, during the period of activity. The Dear Boss letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter are given the strongest consideration as to having actually come from the killer. Other people think that there were multiple killers involved, and that maybe the letters weren't even written by the killer, but they were written by a journalist who was trying to sell newspapers. So, for this week, I decided to revisit the work of Randy Williams, who is the author of Sherlock Holmes and the Autumn of Terror. And there are two reasons for this. And the biggest reason actually is because I watched the movie A Study in Terror, which is about Sherlock Holmes trying to investigate the Jack the Ripper crimes, and I'll be discussing that later in the episode. But I was like, if I'm going to watch a Sherlock Holmes movie, then might as well just listen to what Randy Williams has to say. He incorporated Sherlock Holmes into his Jack the Ripper book. So the first point is that he's an example of someone who has a different theory in the Ripper case, and that's that, number one, there were multiple killers, and number two, that the crimes were committed for a calculated reason. And I watched the interview with Randy Williams on the channel A Psych for Sore Minds. That's the name of it. A Psych for Sore Minds. Sore spelled S-O-R-E. A Psych for Sore Minds. And I definitely think that it's a deep-end interview. It really jumps into everything, like, very, very intensely. And I would recommend watching Randy Williams on the Jack the Ripper Tour YouTube channel first, because I think without any type of familiarity with his Ripper theory, you would have no idea what he's talking about. Whereas when you did the interview on the Jack the Ripper Tour channel, I don't know if he had practiced his podcast spiel a little bit or organized his material, but it was presented in a much clearer and a very cogent manner. Whereas this A Sight for Sore Minds was really, as I said, just jumping into the deep end, and he's talking about his complicated theory from different aspects of it, and I think that it would have been a little bit hard to follow if it was the first time that you heard him talking. But he had the idea that there were three people that were responsible for the Whitechapel homicides: Louis Diemschutz, Isaac Kosa Brodsky, and Samuel Friedman. And Louis Diemschutz was one of the witnesses that was present at the murder of Elizabeth Stride. She was the third victim of Jack the Ripper. And one of the points that supports this is something that I talk about very frequently on the channel, and that is that Louis Diemschutz is riding his horse and cart down the street. Bear in mind, it's the dark of night, and the horse shies at the scent of blood. So then he recognizes that something is wrong, and then he stops, and then he goes out, and he finds the body of Elizabeth Stride. Now, this is something that was also discussed in the Barlow and Watt documentary. They even have an actor playing Louis Diemschutz. This was done in the 1970s, and Louis Diemschutz is saying that if his horse had never shied at the scent of blood, he wouldn't even have noticed the body of Elizabeth Stride. And Randy Williams was first tipped off to some suspicious activity involving Louis Diemschutz because he did not think that that was true. He works on a horse farm in Pennsylvania, and he said very clearly that horses do not shy at the scent of blood. And also in Whitechapel in England, they are selling all types of meat in the markets, including horse meat. I mean, you're going to have, of course, beef and chicken, but even horse meat was sold in Whitechapel in 1888. So, firstly, he thought that was a lie. Now, I've shared that with you guys before in previous Ripper Wednesday episodes. Here's an additional piece of information that was shared in his interview on A Sight with Sore Minds. Also, working on a horse farm, he said that horses do not stay put when they are bothered. If something had bothered the horse to the point where it could no longer walk, then Louis Diemschutz wouldn't have been able to just get off the cart, walk over to the body, and the horse wouldn't have just stayed there. The horse would have bolted, or the horse would have behaved erratically. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the ultimate response, that he, again, recognized that story is completely inconsistent with behavior of a horse. So Louis Diemschutz was making it up. Now, Louis Diemschutz was a Russian Jew or Eastern European Jew, and I mean, our conventional concept of Russia might have been somewhat different in 1888 compared to what we're thinking of now. And the name Diemschutz is also something that I've even thought of. Well, that doesn't sound like a Russian name. I know that perhaps he's coming at it from, or that he's Jewish, so he's perhaps has some type of Yiddish sounding name. But even Randy Williams points that out by saying that Diemschutz is and was most likely not his birth name, but instead it was something that perhaps he made up when he came to England. And depending on which language you like to use, German or Yiddish, it could mean protector of women or protector of smoke. Smoke meaning illusion. And that he views Louis Diemschutz as a very suspicious and conniving individual. So, as far as this thing about horse behavior, I follow one page on Facebook about that, also is a horse farm, and I decided to contact them. And I said, hey, there's this guy out there that's named Randy Williams, and he's telling the story about Jack the Ripper and talking a lot about horse behavior. What do you guys think about this stuff, that a horse would never shy at the scent of blood? A horse would never stay put if it were bothered. If someone got off the cart, it would bolt. Talking about the story of Louis Diemschutz. And they simply said that, okay, I'm unable to answer your question. I suggest that you contact an equine behaviorist. And I'm going to do just that. I want to actually get some answers in this story. And with the case of, the three suspects, Louis Diemschutz, Isaac Kosabradsky, and Samuel Friedman, that's exactly what we want to find out. Were any of these people involved with the Ripper crimes? And I'm going to tell you guys something else that is also very honest. The reason why I do Ripper Wednesday, the reason why I do Black Box Online Radio is because I share my journey with you. I talk to you guys about the reasons and why I'm investigating this stuff, why I'm learning this stuff. It is a learning process for me. And in this interview, on A Psych for Sore Minds, Randy Williams also said something that I am sadly confessing to you that I was unaware of, and that is that one of his suspects for the Ripper crimes, Isaac Kosabradsky, was only 17 years old at the time. And he believes that Louis Diemschutz was the either orchestrator, manager, or director of the Ripper crimes, and that the other two participants were Isaac Kosabradsky and Samuel Friedman, who were present in the vicinity of the murder of Elizabeth Stride. I mean, that's the nutshell version. But 17 years old, I have to be blunt. I thought that his narrative on the murder of Elizabeth Stride made so much sense. She was the third victim of Jack the Ripper, the one who was not mutilated, and the first victim of the double event, which took place on September 30th of 1888. And her throat was slashed, but she had not been strangled, and she had not been mutilated either. And as Barlow and Watt point out, again, that's a fictitious mockumentary series, I guess. It's a presentation that's done by two actors, but the Barlow and Watt documentary talks about how Elizabeth Stride should also have only been the only woman who would have screamed. And I thought that his narrative about how Isaac Kosabradsky committed the murder of Elizabeth Stride was, again, just a clear and cogent narrative. It made sense to me. And that Louis Diemschutz lied and covered it up. Even if you don't accept the entire theory that Louis Diemschutz, Samuel Friedman, and Isaac Kosabradsky were responsible for all of the Ripper crimes, I could comprehend that as to how and why that would have taken place. But 17 years old, I mean, I just don't believe the murderer of Liz Stride was that young. That seems like somebody who had a little bit more familiarity with committing crimes, or just, handling women or being aggressive toward women. And as I've also learned, the murder of Liz Stride took place with a different knife than was used in the other Ripper crimes. It was a shorter, smaller knife. But you could think about what the Ripper says in his own letter, the Saucy Jackie postcard, that the first one squealed a bit, the only victim that screamed. So the Ripper's worried about getting caught, so he just slashes her throat and gets out of there as quickly as he can, as stealthily as he can, so he can be undetected. And then he goes to Mitre Square and finds Catherine Eddowes. So, Randy Williams has this theory that the Jack the Ripper murders were organized by the Russian anarchist Peter Kropotkin, and they were done so to persuade and alter modern culture. And the evidence for this is that the location where Liz Stride was murdered was a men's socialist workers club, which was actually an anarchist movement. Peter Kropotkin was the famous anarchist, and that it was done indirectly to change the way that people were thinking, because the anarchists hated prostitution and they also were opposed to the church, and that the different dates in Ripper activity match up to certain dates in the church both the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. Catherine Eddowes was even murdered in Mitre Square, the fourth victim of Jack the Ripper, and the hat that the Pope wears was the mitre, is called a mitre. So all of these things that would deter people from the conventional aspects of society that they were opposed to. He believes that it was created by Peter Kropotkin. It was then sent to his emissary Louis Diemschutz, and then Diemschutz directed Samuel Friedman and Isaac Kosa-Brodsky to commit the murders. So there's somewhat of a conspiracy theory involved, but I at least can comprehend what he's saying. And I've always thought that about Randy Williams when I would watch him in other interviews. It's like he knows what he's talking about. I mean, he's not just babbling and talking in circles. But at the same time, I mean, there are some doubts that I have about a 17-year-old murdering Elizabeth Stride, and I would like to know the truth about this thing involving the horse behavior, because it could very simply be something to the contrary. Maybe the horse did get bothered by the scent of blood, and maybe the horse did stay put because it was attached to the cart. But what do you think about that theory? Do you believe that there were 3 participants in the Jack the Ripper crimes, or do you think that this was the work of a single killer? And I told you I watched the movie A Study in Terror, which is a Sherlock Holmes film that has Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson investigating the Ripper case. And firstly, I was very surprised that it used the real names of the victims, starting even with Emma Smith and then going to Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman. And it's, I mean, I know that as an American, sometimes I don't get British humor, but some of the people are just so overdone, and like, I know that they're acting, but it's like, hello, my name's Annie Chapman. I've got a new bonnet. I'm gonna go get some money. And I was like, well, are you guys for real? You're trying to like tell me that this is how you think people would have been acting? And again, this is a fictional film. 1965 was when it was made, and it's recreating 1888. But firstly, you have Sherlock Holmes saying that no respectable woman would have been out on the streets at this hour. No respectable woman would have been out on the streets in the dark of night unless she was a prostitute. That is something that was explored in the film, and I have to disagree with that completely. Again, it's just a movie, but one of the biggest reasons why the women were out on the streets is because lodging was very expensive, and what people did was, at the time, they would sometimes even resort to drinking to try and get rid of the cold, and the drink of choice was gin at the time because gin was less expensive, so people would just get drunk and pass out on the street. And this is what has led certain people to believe that the Ripper's victims were not actually women of the night or even prostitutes at all. Several people have discussed this, and they say that, very simply, they were just women who were out on the streets because they couldn't afford lodging, and that they would just get drunk or intoxicated, or they would start talking to men. You even see this in A Study in Terror, where someone, Annie Chapman, actually the actress that's playing Annie Chapman, the second victim of Jack the Ripper, is walking up and down just talking to different guys saying, okay, well, you can have it for a discount tonight. Okay, we'll have it for free. I just need a place to stay. And she actually goes to a slaughterhouse and goes to one of her regular clients and then starts talking to a different man, just saying that she needs a place to stay for the night because she doesn't have the money for rent. And ultimately, both of them just say, they're busy working in the slaughterhouse, so they can't spend time with her. And then she gets murdered by Jack the Ripper, in the recreation, that is. So, I mean, I think that it's an interesting choice to actually use the names of the real victims. They talk about first Emma Smith and then Polly Nichols and Annie Chapman, as I said, but some other major differences is that with the murder of Emma Smith that was depicted in A Study in Terror, the knife was left inside the body. That was something that I remembered very clearly, that she was stabbed in the neck, and the quote-unquote Ripper left the knife in her neck and walked away. And then once you see that the crimes began to escalate, and that they did their best to try and show that the Ripper was mutilating the bodies of the victims, and that's also something that's difficult to show on film, and other people just simply don't want to see that. So I definitely think that it was a reasonably entertaining film, but what I don't think it did was capture the brilliance of Sherlock Holmes, because somebody once said this on a podcast. The reason why we like Sherlock Holmes is because he's not real. Because no matter how good a real-life detective is, Sherlock Holmes is always supposed to be one step ahead of them. No matter how good a real-life detective is, Sherlock Holmes is always supposed to be better or more insightful, or has this way of seeing evidence that no one else can see. And it's almost like a superhuman ability, and I didn't quite get that from the Sherlock Holmes that was presented in A Study in Terror from 1965. For example, the film begins with him asking Mrs. Hudson, where's his tobacco for the pipe that he's going to smoke? I mean, when I'm thinking about Benedict Cumberbatch and Martin Freeman and Sherlock was made several years ago, he certainly wouldn't have had to ask a question like that. He would have just known where his tobacco was. So, I mean, it's definitely not someone who just always is acting like this high-functioning sociopath that can connect the observations together in a more organized, and not only organized, but efficient manner. Very, very fast thinking. However, though, I mean, I've noticed that there are a lot of Jack the Ripper movies that have been made, and I really haven't seen one that has been any disappointing at all. The Lodger from 1927 was based on Jack the Ripper. There's even a Jack the Ripper film from 1959 also, but that doesn't even use the real names of the victims. And this is the first film that I've watched that's actually going through the victims in a chronological order. One more time, the film is called A Study in Terror about Sherlock Holmes investigating the Jack the Ripper case. And much like the last Jack the Ripper report, I would like to conclude with something from a different Jack the Ripper suspect, and his name is Francis Thompson, who was more famous for his poetry rather than being a Ripper suspect. And last week I read you one of Francis Thompson's poems called The Hound of Heaven, and I would like to read one now called A May Burden. Francis Thompson is the subject of the book Francis Thompson, the works of Jack the Ripper, the works of Francis Thompson. How can I mangle that one? Jack the Ripper, the works of Francis Thompson by Richard Patterson, and he believes that this person was the Ripper. But I'd like to conclude this episode by reading A May Burden. Though meadow ways as I did tread, the corn grew in great lusty head, and hay the beeches burgeoned. Goddess Fay, by Goddess Fay, it is the month, the jolly month of May. God ripe the wine and corn, I say, and wenches for the marriage day, and boys to teach love's comely play, by Goddess Fay, by Goddess Fay. It is the month, the jolly month, it is the jolly month of May. As I went down by lane and lea, the daisies so paradis, blushets, I said, I well do see, by Goddess Fay, by Goddess Fay, the thing ye think of in this month, hey go this jolly month of May. And as down I went by Ryan Oats, the blossoms smelt of kisses' throats, of birds turned kisses into notes, by Goddess Fay, by Goddess Fay. The kisset is a growing flower, I trow this jolly month of May. God send a mouth to every kiss, seeing the blossom of this bliss, by gathering doth grow, certes, by Goddess Fay, by Goddess Fay. Thy brow garland pushed all aslant, tells but I, not wanton, May. And I don't know about you guys when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, alright, I get that this guy is some type of lonely, sexually repressed individual, but was he Jack the Ripper? Everything I see in Francis Thompson's poetry is pointing a little bit away from that. Now, some of his poems do get very dark and morbid, and Richard Patterson does incorporate that into his theory, the interpretations of his poetry. But that one, I just think that sounds like a lonely guy that has an intelligent, sensitive soul. But that's just up to me. One more time, that was one of the poems of Francis Thompson. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNid88 over on Instagram. And I will see you over there. Until next time.